What were Friedrich Nietzsche's views on religion?
In Beyond Good and Evil, 1886, The Genealogy of Morals, 1887, and The Antichrist, 1888. Nietzsche described Christianity as a sickly ethics of weak people's resentment of the strong. He thought that before Christianity blonde beasts had become masters of their subjects through daring acts of ferocity. That ancient ruling class was naturally cruel to those not as strong. These fierce rulers saw their weak subjects as base, while their own traits of pride, courage, reverence for tradition, and loyalty to one another constituted their virtues. The old aristocratic system of values was in time destroyed through the machinations of a priestly class, which denied itself by turning its cruelty inward, and encouraged the oppressed masses to identify what hurt them as morally bad evil. Christianity was thus a slave morality in Nietzsche's opinion. Its uselessness for living fully evident in the worship of a slain God and a rejection of earthly vitality for hopes of joy in heaven. He thought that Christianity was a powerless religion for powerless people, a slave religion with a slave morality for slaves. But he cautioned the strong, one has to test oneself to see that one is destined for independence and command and do it at the right time. One should not dodge one's tests, though they may be the most dangerous game one can play and are tests that are taken in the end before no witness or judge but ourselves.
How have Japanese, Chinese, and Indian philosophy recently entered Anglo-American philosophy?
Asian philosophy came to the West as Buddhism from Japanese, Chinese and Indian philosophy, and Neo-Confucianism from Chinese philosophy. Given the common thread of Buddhism throughout Asia, many might be tempted to designate all philosophy from Japan, China, and India as Asian philosophy or Eastern philosophy. But there are other systems of thought and religion just as diverse as Buddhist traditions. Also, the different Buddhist traditions derive from cultures that have very distinctive histories, as well as very different current political and economic situations and ties to the West. That their theological dimensions are not Christian, Jewish, or Muslim, is probably all that the philosophies of these areas broadly understood to be more than Buddhism and Confucianism have in common. Although Euro-American intellectuals in other fields have well developed scholarly traditions based on Eastern texts, it should be noted that philosophers, as a profession, are relative latecomers to Eastern philosophy. For instance, the British biochemist Joseph Needham, 1900 to 1995, wrote extensively on technology and science in the history of China. The 19th-century German novelist Hermann Hesse introduced an international readership to Indian thought and Buddhism in his 1922 novel Siddhartha, and philosophy's own Gottfried Leibniz, 1646 to 1716, was fascinated by Chinese thought. The question is, what do philosophers put on their curricula from Eastern thought in new ways that emphasize a commonality of philosophical interests? Again, the answer is Buddhism, on account of its resonance with Western metaphysics and epistemology, and Confucianism for what it teaches about virtue ethics.
Who was Jacques Derrida?
The Algerian-born French intellectual theorist, Jacques Derrida, 1930 to 2004, is widely considered to be the founder of deconstructionism, which he presented in his introduction to a 1962 translation of Edmund Husserl's, 1859 to 1938, The Origin of Geometry. In a later interview, Derrida said of this work, using his distinctive terminology that has made so many Anglo-American philosophers dismissive of deconstruction, in this essay the problematic of writing was already in place as such, bound to the irreducible structure of deferral in its relationships to consciousness. Presence, science, history, and the history of science, the disappearance or delay of the origin, etc. This essay can be read as the other side, recto or verso, as you wish, of speech and phenomena. Using Husserl's standard that for something to be known it must be known by human consciousness, Derrida developed a critique of the metaphysics of presence, the tradition that imagined knowledge as a thing known to God or the absolute consciousness. He called the whole history of Western philosophy a search for a transcendental being that serves as the origin or guarantor of meaning. His principal books include Speech and Phenomena and other essays on Husserl's theory of signs. 1973, of Grammatology, 1976, Writing and Difference, 1978, Spurs, Nietzsche Styles, 1979. The Archaeology of the Frivolous, Reading Kondelik, 1980, Margins of Philosophy, 1982. The Postcard, From Socrates to Freud and Beyond, 1987, Edmund Husserl's Origin of Geometry. An Introduction, 1962, 1989, of Spirit, Heidegger and the Question, 1989, and The Gift of Death, 1995. Derrida is most famous for Of Grammatology, 1972.
What was René Descartes like as a person?
It is difficult to say. In contemporary terms, Descartes would probably be considered a fearful, anxious, and self-absorbed man with social disorders. He was the only 17th-century philosopher who never had a patron or a secure post. And he was not independently wealthy. Descartes moved to Holland to escape the distractions of Paris, so that he could concentrate on his work. He was secretive about his personal life and moved his household about once a year during a 20-year period. Wherever he was, he conducted experiments, sometimes getting animal organs from local butchers. One account has it that when he studied vision, he literally looked through a calf's eyes. Descartes was greatly interested in special foods and diets. Possibly as a way to prolong life or even to achieve immortality. At times he was a vegetarian. It's clear this was not for moral reasons. Given his belief that animals are machines, and other times he thought that the secret lay in eggs. With a servant named Helena Jans, he had an illegitimate daughter. While Descartes' daughter, Francine, is usually described as illegitimate by biographers. Her baptism was recorded in 1635 in the Reformed Church in Deventer. Francine died at the age of 5 from scarlet fever, and Descartes expressed great sorrow for this loss. Descartes' motto was said to have been, "A life well hidden is a life well lived." Another version has it as, "I advance masked."
What were Rousseau's most influential ideas?
Rousseau proclaimed and argued for the natural goodness of man. It was society and custom that created human vice and evils in the world, he felt. For example, in the natural state, primitive man had a form of wholesome self-love, or amour de soi, which in society became amour propre, or pride and vanity about how he was regarded by others. In the natural condition, man is born free, but in society, the institution of private property, which Rousseau considered a form of theft, as well as other corrupt institutions, resulted in man being everywhere in chains. Rousseau posited a natural sympathy in human relations, which had been corrupted by greed, and a simple piety, which was distorted by organized religion. This vision of the goodness of man was set forth in Discourse on the Arts and Sciences. 1750, and in his novels. In Of the Social Contract, Principles of Political Right, 1762. Rousseau addressed the same questions treated by Thomas Hobbes, 1588 to 1679, and John Locke, 1632 to 1704, of how, given original freedom, a good government can be imagined to come about, and what such a government would be like. Rousseau postulated that individual rights are given up to the community in the founding contract. In return, the individual becomes a citizen whose rights are protected. But this is an active model of citizenship because the individual is required to agree to the general will at the same time that he or she acts in self-interest.
Who were the scholastics?
The scholastics were the first heavyweight philosophical school of medieval times. Their 11th century founder was St. Anselm of Canterbury, 1033 to 1109, who was followed by Peter Abelard, 1079 to 1142, and Peter Lombard, 1100 to 1160, in the 12th century. During the same time, Jewish and Islamic philosophers reintroduced Aristotle to the West. This innovation culminated in the work of Saint Thomas Aquinas, c. 1225–1274, followed by John Duns Scotus, 1266–1308.
What is ethical, or moral, relativism?
There are two kinds. Descriptive moral relativism is the view that different cultures have different moral beliefs. Prescriptive or normative moral relativism is the view that the whole of what's right is what people in a given society think is right. The result of this view is that moral disagreement can't be rationally debated.
What do Deleuze and Guattari mean by their bizarre terminology?
Gilles Deleuze, 1925–1995, and Pierre-Félix Guattari, 1930–1992, took pride in using new terms that they did not define, but which they thought readers would understand. Mutant universes of value seems to refer to new systems of value that are unconventional and popular. Examples in our time would be interests in vampires in entertainment, the growing importance of electronic communication, and the change in household pets from mere pets to members of the families with whom they live. The importance of town hall meetings in the United States would be an example of micropolitics. Schizoanalysis, which suggests contradictory meanings, was used to refer to Deleuze and Guattari's project of getting rid of the idea of the Freudian idea of the unconscious as a way of explaining human behavior. Becoming woman refers to the fact that contemporary women are actively involved in defining their own social roles.
What was Peter Kropotkin's view of Darwinism in society?
Kropotkin did not think that competition was a good survival strategy, whether in the animal or human worlds. In his Mutual Aid, A Factor of Evolution, 1902, he wrote the following. In the animal world we have seen that the vast majority of species live in societies, and that they find in association the best arms for the struggle for life. Understood, of course, in its wide Darwinian sense, not as a struggle for the sheer means of existence, but as a struggle against all natural conditions unfavorable to the species. The animal species, in which individual struggle has been reduced to its narrowest limits, and the practice of mutual aid has attained the greatest development, are invariably the most numerous, the most prosperous, and the most open to further progress. The mutual protection which is obtained in this case, the possibility of attaining old age and of accumulating experience, the higher intellectual development, and the further growth of sociable habits, secure the maintenance of the species, its extension, and its further progressive evolution. The unsociable species, on the contrary, are doomed to decay. However, Kropotkin did hold that revolution is part of human evolution and that anarchism was a return to a condition that had been distorted by modern repressive institutions. Because human beings are naturally social, government is unnecessary.
Was military invasion of Europe part of the religious practice of Islam during the medieval period?
Yes, but the Islamic religion was not opposed to Christianity. In fact, as one of three great religions of the book, Islam had much in common with Christianity, as well as Judaism. Its doctrine included a belief in one God, the importance of prayer, the idea of a church or brotherhood for all members of the religion, and the obligation to care for the poor. What was distinctive about Islam, in comparison to Christianity, was its rejection of the idea of the Catholic Trinity. Requirements of fasting and other forms of bodily purification on holy days, and the necessity for every Muslim follower to make at least one journey or pilgrimage to Mecca. The continual importance of God and homage to Old Testament prophets was shared with Judaism. Although, unlike Judaism, Islam had a positive conception of heaven.
Who were the pre-Socratics?
The pre-Socratics, the term simply means those philosophers who came before Socrates. Came from outlying Greek city-states located on islands far from Athens, which was the cultural center of ancient Greece. Their ideas circulated widely among Greek intellectuals all over the civilized Western world. In chronological order, the main pre-Socratics were Thales, c. 624–c. 546 BCE, Anaximander, c. 610–c. 546 BCE, Anaximenes of Miletus, 580–500 BCE, Pythagoras, c. 575–495 BCE, Heraclitus, 535–475 BCE, Anaxagoras, c. 500–428 BCE, Parmenides, N.D., Zeno of Elea, c. 490–430 BCE, Empedocles, c. 490–430 BCE, Leucippus, N.D., and Democritus, c. 460–c. 370 BCE. They were well-educated men who had enough leisure time to ponder deep questions.
What is moral conventionalism?
Ethical or moral conventionalism is the view that what makes something good or an action right is a general cultural belief. Ethical conventionalism has descriptive and prescriptive forms. Prescriptive conventionalism says that we ought to follow conventions. Descriptive conventionalism says that we do follow conventions.
What are some of Peter Singer's views?
Singer, 1946, has at times argued that the lives of healthy adult animals are of greater value than those of severely impaired human infants. Such views have met with great controversy. When Singer was hired by Princeton University in 1999, there were dramatic public demonstrations by and for disabled people. And the university administration hired armed guards to protect him. Singer, proceeding on utilitarian grounds, does not believe that animals have rights, but rather that their well-being is intrinsically good and their pain and destruction intrinsically bad. Singer is not a deep ecologist, because he does not attribute intrinsic value to the well-being of mountains, rivers, or plants, or whatever is not sentient. Singer has claimed that the privileging of human life and well-being over that of animals is speciesism, which, in principle, is no different from racism and sexism.
Who was Arete of Cyrene?
Arete of Cyrene, c. 400 c. 340 BCE, the daughter of Aristippus, a friend and student of Socrates, who was present at his death, succeeded her father as head of the Cyrenaic school. She taught ethics in the hedonistic tradition and natural philosophy, for 30 years.
What was Charles Peirce's pragmaticism?
Peirce's starting point in his pragmaticism was his activity and self-identification as a scientist. Peirce thought that philosophy was philosophy of science and that logic was the logic of science. As a pragmaticist, Peirce is best known for two articles, The Fixation of Belief and How to Make Our Ideas Clear, published in Popular Science Monthly, under different titles, in 1877 and 1878, respectively. In these works, he defended science as the best way to overcome doubt and presented the pragmaticist idea of clear concepts. He claimed that concepts, or the meanings of scientific terms, must have cash value. The cash value of a concept is the difference it makes in experience to have the concept, compared with not having it. The entire meaning of a clear concept lay in its consequences. The consequences meaning of a scientific concept were possible observations under conditions that could be specified. That is, the concept had to generate predictions and it doesn't matter if the predictions were accurate or not, just so long as it could predict something that would happen.
Was Descartes a Cartesian?
Yes, René Descartes was a Cartesian in the sense that he defended his views. But the answer is no, too. In that he did not literally mean that the human mind and the body were two separate things. He famously wrote in Meditation 2 in his Meditations on First Philosophy. 1641 I am not in my body like a pilot in a ship. His intention was to make an abstract distinction between the mind and the body. But because he did not give a satisfactory account of their interaction, Descartes is still stuck with the mind-body dualism of Cartesianism.
What has been Arnini's philosophical influence?
Nice, 1912. Broadest influence has probably been from his overall sense that there are spiritual, if not religious, values in our proper connection with natural environments. People should respect and care for such environments as an elevated activity. Many contemporary environmentalists, theoretical and practical, share Nice's intuition that human beings benefit from contact with nature and animals in deeply nourishing ways that cannot be duplicated by commercial forms of entertainment, or even human interaction. Acknowledgement of such benefits has led virtue ethicists such as Thomas E. Hill, Jr., 1951, to claim that how we treat non-human beings both reveals our own character and partly constitutes it. In contemporary environmental debates, another way of stating the deep shallow ecological distinction is via instrumental and intrinsic values. A being has intrinsic value if it is good in and of itself, whereas its value is instrumental if its good is what it is good for. This theoretical point is important ethically in thought going back to Immanuel Kant, 1724-1804, which distinguishes between categorical or absolute imperatives and hypothetical or instrumental ones. But whereas Kant thought that the only thing with intrinsic value is the goodwill of a rational creature, a human being, some environmentalists have extended intrinsic value to all living beings.
What have been the major trends in Latin American philosophy?
Many commentators identify four periods in the 500-year history of philosophy in Latin America: colonial, independentist, positivist, and contemporary. Overall, Latin American philosophers have been actively involved in political and social events in their countries. They have not, until very recently, incorporated indigenous worldviews into their intellectual perspectives. The colonial period, 1550 to 1750, was characterized by interest in medieval scholastic philosophy, such as the work of Thomas Aquinas, c. 1225 to 1274, and Francisco Suarez, 1548 to 1617. During this time, Mexico and Peru were important in intellectual life, and the influence of Spain dominated. The Royal and Pontifical University of Mexico, founded in 1553, was where Alonso de la Vera Cruz, 1504 to 1584, Tomás de Mercado, 1530 to 1575, and Antonio Rubio, 1548 to 1615, flourished. Antonio Rubio's Mexican Logic, 1605, was a celebrated textbook on Aristotelian logic throughout Europe. Bartolomé de las Casas, 1474–1566, In Defense of the Indians is still widely read. During the independentist philosophical period, 1750–1850, intellectual interest was focused on political issues. Although European rationalism, empiricism, and ethics were also taken up. The Positivist period, 1850–1910. Embraced European positivism and had local social and political applications. It was assumed by many, after independence, that positivist philosophy, backed up by social science, would usher in order and progress. Juan Bautista Alberti, 1812–1884, in his Idea, 1842, sought to modify European positivism to the specific circumstances of Latin America.
What is a meme?
In The Selfish Gene, 1976, British evolutionary biologist, Professor and author Richard Dawkins coined the term as being on a par with gene. A meme, for instance, a tune, recipe, moral system, or style of dress gets passed on from one generation to the next via cultural interaction. Although memes are not usually held to be physically inherited the way that genes are, social biologists believe them to be subject to natural selection and mutation.
Is philosophy only found in the West?
No. As individual intellectual tendencies and cultural traditions, philosophy has been present in all human societies since the beginning of recorded history and probably farther back than that. In the United States and Europe, philosophy, as an intellectual profession practiced by academics, developed as an official part of the higher education curriculum during the 20th century. But many societies, particularly those that are still peopled by the original or indigenous inhabitants of a place, have maintained their philosophies through oral traditions. Oral traditions in African philosophy and Native American philosophy often deal with questions about time, space, origins, and ethics. There are also well-developed textual traditions, going back at least as far as Socrates. In Indian philosophy, Japanese philosophy, and Chinese philosophy, collectively called Asian philosophy or Eastern philosophy, these systems of thought are increasingly part of standard philosophy curricula in the United States, as are comparative philosophy, African American philosophy, and Latin American philosophy.
What is the difference between critical theory and structuralism?
There is no clear distinction of practice that practitioners of both schools of thought would accept. Many structuralists denied being structuralists, and some critical theorists were unaware of the term critical theory. But from the standpoint of a reader, it may help to keep in mind that both structuralism and critical theory provide analyses of society that need not be accepted by the members of society being analyzed. The term critical theory is associated with the Frankfurt School, which developed the 20th century version of scholarly Marxism. The term structuralism refers to a study of mental structures in society. Critical theory seeks to provide analyses that further progressive and egalitarian social goal. Structuralism also uses critical theory. Although the members and followers of the Frankfurt School were not narrowly political, their Marxist legacy tended to point them in certain political directions. While structuralists might have shared certain goals with Marxian critical theorists, their subjects were other social institutions besides government. They also took up Freudian psychology and were instrumental in laying the foundations for a new focus on language and symbols as an important philosophical subject. In some quarters, given the successors or intellectual heirs of structuralism, language and the symbolic order became the only intellectual subject. That is, the structuralists paved the way for intellectual postmodernism, which is also known as post-structuralism.
What are problems with functionalism as a theory of mind?
Functionalism may result in attributing minds to complex systems that we otherwise would not consider to have minds. It might result in denying the presence of minds that operate according to different causal principles than our own. Indeed, Hilary Putnam, 1926, himself later rejected functionalism on the grounds that beliefs could not be computational states because their content was determined by external facts, and beliefs were also part of a whole system of knowledge. At the same time as Paul Kripke, 1940, and Keith Donnellan, 1931. He developed a new causal or direct theory of meaning, which was published in The Meaning of Meaning, 1975.
How is environmentalism related to feminism?
Feminists have addressed the exploitation of natural environments as part of overall cultural misogyny insofar as the earth is at least metaphorically female. Also, some of the exploitation of animals is centered on female animals. Chris Cuomo explores this last thesis and characterizes living beings in an interesting way as having dynamic charm in feminism and ecological communities, 2002.
What is the Socratic method?
The Socratic method has two main parts. First, a question is asked about a difficult subject. Second, the answer is followed up with another question, and a dialogue follows. Socrates often asked difficult questions of people who were considered wise and competent. And when their answers were not satisfactory, Socrates asked more questions. More generally, and without the questioner intending to make a fool of the person of whom he asks a question. The Socratic method is a way of teaching that involves an ongoing conversation about a subject between a teacher and student.
Why are Immanuel Kant's epistemology and metaphysics transcendental?
To this day, philosophers dispute whether Kant was providing a theory of how the mind in fact works or instead a critical theory of how we ought to view knowledge. In either case, Kant's epistemology and metaphysics are both transcendental. His epistemology is transcendental in that he reasons a priori from what is known to what must be the case in order to account for what is known. And his metaphysics is transcendental in that what ultimately exists exceeds and eludes both our direct knowledge and full understanding. Even though we are justified in postulating it according to certain principles of reason.
Who was George Santayana?
George Santayana, born Jorge Agustin Nicolas Ruiz de Santayana y Boraz, 1863–1952, was a philosopher, poet, art critic, and author of the international best-selling novel The Last Puritan, 1935, new edition, 1936. His father was Spanish and he was born in Madrid, but his Scottish mother brought him to the United States when he was 9 and enrolled him in the Boston Latin School. In 1889 he received a Ph.D. in philosophy from Harvard, with Josiah Royce, 1855–1916, as his advisor. In 1892 he accepted an instructorship at Harvard and later became professor of philosophy, teaching there for 20 years. Santayana's students included authors Conrad Aiken, T.S. Eliot, Robert Frost, Wallace Stevens, and Walter Lippmann, as well as U.S. Supreme Court Justice Felix Frankfurter. Santayana retired from Harvard in 1912 and spent the remainder of his life writing and traveling in Europe. His main publications are The Sense of Beauty, 1896, Interpretations of Poetry and Religion, 1900. The Life of Reason, 5 volumes, 1905–1906, Skepticism and Animal Faith, 1923, The Realms of Being. 4 volumes, 1927–1940, Persons and Places, 1944, The Middle Span, 1945, and My Host the World, 1953. In addition to numerous other books and essays. Santayana's published correspondence to over 350 respondents runs to 8 volumes.
What were the shared goals of the St. Louis Hegelians?
Although Friedrich Hegel, 1770–1831, was chosen as the guide for the group by Henry C. Brockmeyer, 1826–1906, their interests were not so much in theoretical abstractions as in understanding their own life and times, particularly the U.S. Civil War. According to Denton Jacques Snyder, 1841–1925, their goals were to philosophize practical life, to be able to give a rational account of their vocations, and achieve self-realization. They also wanted to contribute to the future greatness of society. Philosophy for them was closer to a religious practice than an academic one.
What are the four causes as defined by Aristotle?
Scientific knowledge provides causal explanations of real kinds of things. Aristotle asserted that there are four causes: formal, material, efficient, and final. The formal cause of your dog is what makes the animal a dog. It is its dog essence. The material cause of the dog is the physical stuff of which it is made, its matter. Aristotle believed that matter or physical reality is the same in all things but uniquely informed by their specific forms. The efficient cause of the dog is its birth and the food and water it consumes. The final cause of the dog is its ultimate purpose or function as a dog, its full development as a dog, and its ability to be a loyal friend and helper to human beings in general. And because it is your dog, yours in particular. Form is the actuality of a substance and matter is its potential. The particular puppy you first brought home had the physical potential to become the fully excellent creature it grew into.
What are some highlights of Johann Gottlieb Fichte's career?
As a student at Leipzig University, Fichte studied Benedict de Spinoza's, 1632–1677, philosophy. After he discovered Immanuel Kant, 1724–1804, he wrote an attempt at a critique of all revelation. 1792, in which he tried to show that morality was the major part of religion. This was inspired by Kant's view that an understanding of morality requires an understanding of religion.
What was Locke's solution to the Cartesian mind-body problem?
Locke held that all of our knowledge comes to us from our ideas and that we do not have a clear idea of either material or immaterial substance. It follows from this that if substance exists, we do not know anything about it, apart from its qualities that adhere in it. For example, Locke pointed out that we can sense the hardness, color, and malleability of gold, but that we do not know what it is in gold that gives rise to these qualities. He addressed unextended or non-material substance under the subject of personal identity, asking what it is that makes someone the same person. Locke was concerned that when a person was punished on Judgment Day, that the person being punished was the same person who had committed the crimes he or she was charged with. His answer was that in the context of divine reward or punishment on that great day, you are the same person if you have memories of yourself in the past, so that you know it is the same you who committed the acts for which you are being judged. Locke's refusal to posit a form or substance for the soul seemed to contradict the Trinitarian doctrine of three attributes or natures present in one God. Some of his critics, such as British theologian Edward Stillingfleet, accused Locke of denying the possibility of resurrection in the absence of an incorruptible, immaterial soul substance. Locke's reply to Stillingfleet was to reaffirm his belief in the immortality of the soul, as a matter of faith, rather than a fact that could be proved by reason. Stillingfleet believed that some substantial form of a person's body was necessary for there to be a resurrection of that person. Locke's response was to make fun of Stillingfleet by interpreting him to claim that the same body literally had to arise from the grave. Locke wrote, "And I think your lordship will not say that the particles that were separate from the body by perspiration before the point of death were laid up in the grave."
How well were Exum's ideas first received?
John Lutterell, former Chancellor of Oxford University, extracted over 50 heretical claims from Exum's writings and sent them to Pope John XXII, 1249–1334. Exum was summoned to a papal commission in Avignon, where French cardinals had moved the papacy from Rome. This relocation, which lasted from 1309 to 1377, was known as the Babylonian captivity of the papacy. 51 of Exum's offending theses were censured after 2 years, although no charges were brought against him. However, while he was in Avignon, Exum conducted his own investigations of papal concessions to the Franciscans about collective poverty. He concluded that John XXII had contradicted these prior concessions in his own opposition to clerical poverty and that he was no true pope. When Exum heard that Pope John XXII intended to condemn his written judgment and defense of clerical poverty, he fled to the protection of the anti-papal regent in Bavaria. While he was there, the Pope excommunicated him in absentia. The Black Plague was at that time rampant in Bavaria and William of Exum is thought to have died of it.
What kind of life did Ralph Waldo Emerson lead?
Ralph Waldo Emerson, 1803–1882, lost his father when he was just 8 years old, and was sent to Boston Latin School the next year. He attended Harvard College at 14. where he waited on tables at the Commons and tutored to pay for his education. After graduation, he helped his brother in a school for young ladies, which his mother ran in her home. In 1829 Emerson graduated from Harvard Divinity School as a Unitarian minister. But he resigned from that vocation in 1832 because of a disagreement with church administrators. He had married Ellen Louisa Tucker in 1829, but she died of tuberculosis 2 years later at the age of 20. He mourned her deeply, but had also described himself as strangely attracted to a young man while at Harvard, and was later believed to become infatuated with other young men, including author Nathaniel Hawthorne. During travels in Europe after his wife died, Emerson met authors William Wordsworth, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, and Thomas Carlyle. He would correspond with Carlyle 1795 to 1881 until his death in 1881, and philosopher John Stuart Mill, 1806 to 1873. In 1835 Emerson bought a house in Concord, Massachusetts, and married Lydia Jackson, with whom he had 4 children. He was reasonably well off financially, partly due to a lawsuit securing his inheritance from his first wife. And he used part of the money to help Amos Bronson Alcott, 1799 to 1888, his neighbor. Many considered Emerson the greatest orator of his day.
How important was Joseph Marie de Maistre?
In his Freedom and Its Betrayal, philosopher and historian Isaiah Berlin, 1909 to 1997, listed de Maistre as a major opponent to liberty in the Enlightenment. In the 19th century, French literary critic Émile Faguet, 1847 to 1916, described de Maistre as a fierce absolutist, a furious theocrat, an intransigent legitimist, apostle of a monstrous trinity composed of Pope, King and Hangman, always and everywhere the champion of the hardest, narrowest, and most inflexible dogmatism. A dark figure out of the Middle Ages, part learned doctor, part inquisitor, part executioner.
What was Cambridge Platonism?
No discussion of 17th-century philosophy would be complete without at least mention of the Cambridge Platonists. The Cambridge Platonists were a loosely connected group of philosophers, theologians, and humanistic writers who resisted both the new science and rationalistic and empiricist attempts to base philosophy on it. Although they often were unaware of the content of the doctrines that they opposed. In spirit, they were closer to Neoplatonists, such as Plotinus, 205 to 270, and Proclus, 412 to 485, than to Plato, c. 428 c. 348 BCE, with healthy doses of Pythagoras, c. 570 to 495 BCE, and Marsilio Ficino, 1433 to 1499, as well as an interest in Hermes Trismegistus. a mythological figure based on the Egyptian god Thoth and the Greek god Hermes. The main Platonic influence on all the Cambridge Platonists was the idea of a perfect world. Beyond the senses, that was the cause of what we experience through our senses in this world. Those who were influenced by the Neoplatonists combined Christian beliefs with their basic Platonic view, such that the perfect Platonic world was ruled by a force or a deity, like God in Christianity. Their goal was to defend true religion against Calvinism, atheism, and mechanistic philosophers such as René Descartes, 1596–1650, and Thomas Hobbes, 1588–1679. The Cambridge Platonists were not influential for the central development of philosophy, but their individual contributions nonetheless lived on in intellectual life. The basic tenet of Cambridge Platonism was the obscure religious belief, first stated by the Giovanni Pico della Mirandola, 1463–1494, that both Pythagoras and Plato based their philosophy on teachings by Moses that were expressed in the Kabbalah and other facets of the Jewish mystical tradition. Their other beliefs affirmed God's existence, the soul's immortality, and the animation of the natural world by, or with, spirit. They were convinced both that man had free will and that reason was of primary importance in religious matters. However, they were not empiricists, because they believed in innate ideas and innate principles of morality and religion, which were recognizable through intuition. And furthermore, it needs to be kept in mind that not all of those known as Cambridge Neoplatonists shared the same views.
Who was Isaac Newton?
Isaac Newton, 1642–1727, was one of the greatest scientists and natural philosophers of the Western tradition. Alexander Pope wrote his epitaph, "Nature and nature's laws lay hid in sight. God said, 'Let Newton be,' and all was light." Newton made coherent, mathematically sound sense of the Copernican theory. Kepler's and Tycho Brahe's discoveries, and Galileo's findings. He united terrestrial and celestial mechanics in a comprehensive cosmological system that supported further research for over 300 years. His scientific view of the cosmos included a place for the God of Christians, which was much appreciated in his time. Newton's equations are still useful for calculations of motion in the middle range of medium-sized objects close to the surface of Earth. Newton's theory is not useful for subatomic particle research and measurements made in light years.
What were Edmund Burke's political background and beliefs?
Edmund Burke, 1729–1797, was a member of the British House of Commons from 1765 to 1794. In his early career, which was more literary than philosophical, He propounded a romantic view of art. As a statesman, he resisted political and social change based on ideals and abstract ideas. Although he supported political change that would re-establish proven rights or customs. For example, while he was opposed to the French Revolution for its ideals of liberty, equality, fraternity, he was in favor of the Irish movement for independence and the American Revolution.
What was G. E. Moore's naturalistic fallacy?
Moore, 1873 to 1958, contended that goodness cannot be analyzed in terms of any other property. In his Principia Ethica, 1903, he wrote, "It may be true that all things which are good are also something else. Just as it is true that all things which are yellow produce a certain kind of vibration in the light. And it is a fact, that ethics aims at discovering what are those other properties belonging to all things which are good." But far too many philosophers have thought that when they named those other properties they were actually defining good. Moore thought that we know what is good directly, just as we know the color yellow when we see it. Thus, we can only point to an action or a thing and say that is good. We cannot describe to a blind man exactly what yellow is. We can only show a sighted man a piece of yellow paper or a yellow scrap of cloth and say that is yellow. The same is true of what is good.
Who was Michel Foucault?
Michel Foucault, 1926 to 1984, was an acclaimed French philosopher, who also had French licenses in psychology and psychopathology. His father and both grandfathers were medical doctors. And the ways in which he analyzed European culture, through an archaeology of concepts, probably owes as much to medical diagnostic methodology as it does to continental intellectual criticism. His principal works are his published dissertation, Madness and Unreason. A History of Madness in the Classical Age, 1961, The Birth of the Clinic, 1963. The Order of Things, 1966, The Archaeology of Knowledge, 1969, Discipline and Punish. The Origin of the Prison, 1975, and The Multi-Volume History of Sexuality, 1974. The Order of Things was a bestseller in France, leading to his worldwide fame. In that book, Foucault argued that sciences do not simply pop up as sources of truth on their own, but require prior ideas of human nature and truth in order to be supported and accepted as sciences.
What was new about the thinking of the pre-Socratics?
The pre-Socratics looked for natural explanations of natural facts and events. instead of relying on mythological accounts of the actions of the gods to explain the nature of our existence. Because of this approach, the pre-Socratics can be regarded as the first Western scientists. Even though, today, many of their theories sound quaint compared to contemporary science.
Was Copernicus' new theory purely scientific?
No, because there was considerable mysticism in his astronomical ideas. Consider these two passages from his De Revolutionibus Orbium Coelestium Libri 4. Finally, we shall place the Sun himself at the center of the universe. All this is suggested by the systematic procession of events and the harmony of the whole universe. If only we face the facts, as they say, with both eyes open. And, at rest, however, in the middle of everything is the Sun.
What was Bernard Bosanquet's idealist doctrine?
Bosanquet acknowledged a tremendous debt to Friedrich Hegel's, 1770–1831, notion of the absolute, and was modest about his own contributions to Hegelian philosophy, although they were a significant departure. According to Bosanquet, contradictions occur in experiences when there are opposing views of the same fact. Truth is attained by eliminating such contradictions by incorporating them into a larger picture. The totality of human experience contains all of such truths, and that is the absolute. It can be seen from this that Bosanquet had an empiricist interpretation of Hegel's view that itself was a contradiction. Bosanquet also held that the absolute contains all conflicting desires and satisfies all of them. The value of anything lies in its ability to satisfy desires. So the absolute is the standard of all values. We can best realize all of our desires by surrendering our particular forms of them to the absolute. This surrender is religious consciousness.
How did Anaximenes revise the theories of Anaximander?
Anaximenes, c. 580 to 500 BCE, who followed Anaximander in the Ionian school founded by Thales, believed that the primary substance of the universe was air. Air could itself change from hot to cold and back, so with air as the primary substance it was no longer necessary to explain how the primary substance caused the separate perceptible substances. Air could either expand or contract. Expanded air became fire. Contracted air became the denser materials of wind, cloud, water, earth, and stone. In many religious traditions, including Hindu yoga, life itself is breath. The ancient Greeks strongly held this association, going back to the 8th century BCE. But Anaximenes was the first to give it formal expression.
Who was Thomas Kuhn?
Thomas S. Kuhn, 1922 to 1996, became world famous for his idea that scientific progress requires new ways of looking at the world. He was educated at Harvard and taught at the University of California at Berkeley, Princeton University, and the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. He began as a physicist and then studied the history and philosophy of science. While teaching a course on physics to humanities students, he realized that Aristotle's 384 to 322 BCE physics were not as wrong as commonly assumed, but rather made sense in their own intellectual context. His first book, The Copernican Revolution, 1957, explained the intellectual transition from Aristotelian geocentricism to the heliocentric theory. But it was Kuhn's second book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, 1962, that reverberated throughout intellectual communities. Because he showed how science proceeds by quantum leaps when new theories overthrow old theories. After Kuhn became very famous and attended a conference on his work, where everyone used his term paradigm almost as loosely as they do today, he is reported to have told someone, "I am not a Kuhnian."
Who was Margaret Fuller?
Margaret Fuller, 1810 to 1850, organized weekly Saturday conversations with women in Boston to supplement their education and discuss their condition in society. She co-founded the Dial with Ralph Waldo Emerson, 1803 to 1882, in 1840, which was the official Transcendentalist publication for 4 years. Fuller left the magazine in 1842 to write for the New York Tribune. Fuller interviewed intellectuals for the Tribune in England and Italy in 1846, including George Sand, Thomas Carlyle, and the Italian revolutionary Giovanni Asoli, with whom she fell in love. The couple had a child and married. The entire family drowned in a sea accident while returning to the United States, when their ship hit a sandbar 100 yards away from Fire Island. Fuller's main work is Woman in the 19th Century, 1845, in which she argued for women's independence and equality between the sexes. Her great-nephew was the 20th century architect of geodesic domes, Buckminster Fuller.
What are the qualities/characteristics of Friedrich Nietzsche's Overman?
Nietzsche posited the Overman as a new type of human being who would create values in an age when Christianity was no longer a living religion. Unlike the ideal Christian, the Overman would not be meek or ashamed of his strength. He would love life on earth completely, with no need to believe in heaven.
What were some of Newton's career accomplishments?
Newton, 1642 to 1727, was born in Lincolnshire, England, and attended Cambridge University, graduating with A.B. in 1665. Between 1665 and 1667, working independently while stuck at home when Cambridge was shut down due to the plague. He discovered the binomial theorem, the fundamentals of calculus, the modern principle of how light was composed, and the basics of his theory of gravity. He held the post of Lucasian Professor of Mathematics at Cambridge after 1669 and was a Fellow of the Royal Society from 1671 to 1703, after which he served as its president for the rest of his life. Newton's system of the world, or his unifying theory of mechanics and his mathematical physics, was published in Philosophiae Naturalis Principia Mathematica, the mathematical principles of natural philosophy.
What was so revolutionary about the scientific revolution?
What was revolutionary about the scientific revolution was how it emphasized objectivity and the need to look for natural causes for observable events. Many new inventions, such as telescopes, microscopes, thermometers, barometers, air pumps, and electric charge detectors, aided in this new endeavor. The principle of objectivity played out in public discovery, observation, and experimentation that could be duplicated for verification. To be accepted, however, important experiments required credible witnesses, usually men of substantial social status. The goal of exact measurement and descriptions that could be quantified made mathematics a permanent part of science. But the pre-Socratics had already sought naturalistic explanations for natural events and emphasized the importance of number, so those aspects of the scientific revolution were not new. The early modern methods of objectivity were innovative, nevertheless. As the 20th century historian and philosopher of science Thomas Kuhn, 1922 to 1996, pointed out, the classical sciences of antiquity were astronomy, statics, bodies at rest or forces in equilibrium, and optics, which were all associated with mathematics and harmonics. So that advances in one led to advances in the others. In the 16th century, local motion, as something different from Aristotle's idea of motion as qualitative change, was added to the mathematical sciences. In the 17th century, the mathematical sciences were revised by the addition of analytic geometry and calculus. New quantitative laws of motion, new theories of vision, refraction, and color, and the extension of statics to pneumatics, studies of air, fluids, and gases. Still, Kuhn argued that Aristotle and the medievals also understood the importance of observation and experimentation. What was new was not so much the addition of new fields or striking new discoveries. but a change in perspective, new ways of looking at old things.